Earlier in the course, I told you that your TV has several functions, each responsible for a single task. It has functions for changing the channel, controlling the volume, changing brightness, and so on. Now, by the same token, our programs often have tens, hundreds, or even thousands of functions, each doing a single thing. Now, so far, our programs have had only a single function, that is the main function. But now let's see how we can create another function for greeting the user. So just like how we defined the main function, we start with the type of return value of our function. The return value can be of any type, all the types you have learned so far. So it can be an int, it can be a double, a boolean, a string, and so on. But what if our function doesn't return a value? Then we'll have to use the void keyword. Next, we type the name of our function. And just like our variables, our function name should be proper and meaningful. So we're going to call this greet. Next, we type a pair of parentheses. And inside the parentheses, we type 0 or more parameters for this function. We'll come back to this shortly. Next, we add a pair of braces to define a block of code. And this block of code is called the body of this function. Now, within the body, let's use cout to print hello world on the terminal. So now we have defined a function that we can reuse in our program multiple times, just like how we can press the buttons of a remote control multiple times, okay? So here's our function. Now, to use this in our main function, we type the name of the function, followed by parentheses. We say we are calling or invoking or executing this function. So now when we run our program, the control is going to move from the main function over here. Then this line is going to get executed, and then we'll get back to the main function. So anything that we type after, let's say done, will be executed, okay? And by the way, I would like to add an endl here. Good. So let's run our program. There you go. We get these two messages. Now let's take our program to the next level by adding a couple of parameters to this function. So instead of printing hello world, we want to greet someone by their first and last names. So over here, we add a parameter of type string called first name. Now to add additional parameters, we need to separate them using a comma. So string last name. Now we're going to use these parameters in this function just like regular variables. So this parameter is exactly like defining a variable by this name right here. Okay, so delete. Now we're going to print hello first name, followed by a space, and last name. Now down here, we get a compilation error because this function has two parameters, but we haven't supplied any values for these parameters. Now, if you hover our mouse over the function name, we can see the error saying no matching function for call to greet. Requires two arguments, but 0 were provided. So up here, we have defined two string parameters, and that means we have to pass exactly two string values to this function. Nothing more, nothing less. So here I'm going to pass Mosh Hamedani. Okay, now you can see these values are prefixed by the name of the parameter. This is just something that CLion adds. Maybe your IDE doesn't have this feature, okay? Now, we refer to these values as arguments. So this is the difference between parameters and arguments. A lot of people mix up the two, but they're actually different. Parameters are the names that we have defined up here, but arguments are the values that we supply for those parameters, okay? Now, let's run our program. So we say, hello, Mosh Hamedani. Beautiful. Now, how about a function that returns a value? So let's define another function that returns a string. We're going to call this full name. So just like the greet function, we're going to give it two parameters, first name and last name. And the job of this function is to combine the two. So here we have to use the return statement. So because the return type is a string, here we have to return a string value. Now I want to combine the first and last names, so we can type first name plus a space plus last name. So what we are doing here is concatenating or combining a few strings using the concatenation operator, okay? Now we have a reusable function, and this function is doing a single task. It doesn't mean it has a single line of code. It means it has a single task. The only thing that this function is responsible for is combining the first and last names. Now we can call that function. So we call full name and give it Mosh Hamedani. We get the full name and store it in a string, which we can call name. We cannot call this full name because full name is the name of our function. So here we have to use a different name. Okay? Then we can use cout to print the name followed by endo. Now take a look. So Mosh Hamedani, beautiful. Now let's take this to the next level. We can change our greet function. So instead of giving it first and last names, we can just give it a name. And then over here, we simply print hello followed by the name and endo. Now, why did I do that? Well, we're going to reuse our full name function to create the full name for a person, and then we'll pass the full name to the greet function. Let me show you how. So back to our main function. Here we use the full name function. We have the full name. Now we can call the greet function and give it the full name. Take a look. We get the same result as before, but we're not done yet. In this case, we don't really need this variable we have defined here. We can simply pass the full name function to the greet function. So let me grab this piece of code and paste it right here. So let's delete the name variable. So now we're calling the full name function. This will create the full name, and that value will be passed as an argument to the greet function. This is how we can use small functions to solve complex problems. Now here's your exercise. I want you to create a function that receives two integers and returns the maximum of the two. Call that function and then print the result. It's super easy. You can knock it out in a couple of minutes. All right, we're going to define a function that returns an integer called max with two parameters, first and last, or second, that's better. Now here we can have an if statement. If first is greater, then we're going to return first. Otherwise, we're going to return second. Now let's see how we can simplify this code. If the first condition is true, we're going to return the first value. So no code after this if statement is going to get executed. That means we don't really need the else clause here. We can simply put this return statement, but this code will never get executed. Okay? Now, we can make this code even shorter and more concise. We can use the conditional operator we talked about earlier. So let's delete everything. We're going to return. First, we type a condition. If first is greater than second, then we're going to return first. Otherwise, we're going to return second. Okay? Now let's test our function. So we're going to call max and give it 1 and 2. We'll get the result and store it in an integer called larger, and then print it on the terminal. Take a look. So 2 is greater. Great. Now, what if we swap the order of these arguments? Let's make sure our function still works. So I'm going to pass 2 and 1. We still get the same result. What if our arguments are equal? Our function still works. Beautiful. So when defining functions, always make sure to test your function against different values and scenarios.